Are you settling for the enjoyable good you want today, but in the process forfeiting the unknown great of tomorrow? Now, there's a lot there, so maybe I've got to, just kind of restate that. In essence, are you settling for what you want right now that could be enjoyable and good, but in the process, you're forfeiting what is great and better tomorrow? Another way of kind of capturing that thought, that question is this: instant gratification, what I want right now, will always be the tyrant of what is best tomorrow. I mean, what is discipline? Discipline is being willing to do what hurts and is uncomfortable today because of what you want to gain in the future. So let me challenge you that most of us have at least a bent toward not being disciplined and toward settling for what we want now rather than what's best tomorrow. Let me read you a story about a guy who that's exactly how he lived. In the 1930s in Chicago, there was a man called Easy Eddie. Now, some of you remember reading about him on the news, not very many of you, but he worked for Al Capone. Now, Al Capone was virtually owned the city of Chicago and was notorious for enmeshing the city in everything from bootleg booze to prostitution to murder. Al Capone was running the mob in Chicago. And Easy Eddie was Al Capone's lawyer, and he consistently kept Big Al out of prison. And he did this for a very long time. So as a result, Eddie made unbelievable money. I mean, he made big money. He got paid very well for this. As well, he was given a fenced-in mansion that encompassed an entire city block in the city of Chicago. He had live-in staff. I mean, he had everything he could ever want. And in addition, he was living this kind of high life that most of the Chicago mob enjoyed, but giving no thought or consideration to the atrocities that were being done to give him this kind of life. Eddie did have one spot, however. He had a son that he loved dearly. Eddie saw to it that his young son had the best of everything: the best clothes, the best cars, the best education. Nothing was withheld. Money was no object. Despite his involvement with the organized crime, Eddie even tried to teach his son right from wrong. Yeah, that's right. Eddie tried to teach his son to rise above his own sordid life. He wanted him to be a better man than he was. Yet, with all of his wealth and his influence, there were two things that Eddie could not give his son. Two things that Eddie sacrificed to the Capone mob that he could not pass on to his beloved son: a good name and a good example. And I can't imagine that many of you are in the mob. If you are, please make sure you're tithing on your income. No, and I would imagine that many of you do not live the way Easy Eddie lived. And again, if you are, would you just consider giving above and beyond and kingdom builders? But no. But I will say this: I would imagine most of you are living like Easy Eddie. No, I don't mean that you're able to give your kids everything they want and you're able to just enjoy the good American dream life. But I think you and I live like Easy Eddie because we're not thinking about the impact of our decisions and how we're living on the next generation. We're not thinking about the influence we're having and how the way we live and the decisions we make become an example to the next generation. No, we minimize risk and failure, and as a result, we maximize comfort and ease. And any sacrifices we make are short term for what we can get back. So I would say most people live short-sighted lives, giving very little and giving very little thought to how their life impacts others, especially how it impacts the next generation. And then you have these moments like a guy like Easy Eddie, who's like, he's got his son and he's really wants to give his son a good influence. Basically, he's telling his son, don't do what I'm doing. And yet he's living that way. And you know how this works. Your kids become what you are, not what you say. In fact, you want to know what the greatest indicator of how much screen time children will have and how much time they will spend on their phones and devices in the future? How much time their parents spend on their devices. So wait, hey, right now I could probably just end this sermon and many of us need to repent because probably you're feeling convicted or bad about it, going, man, yeah, I spend too much time on my device. And by the way, it doesn't matter whether your kids see it or not. If you're on your phone scrolling at night, guess what your kids are going to do in the future? They're going to be on their phones scrolling at night, right? Like they become what we are. And so I want to bring you to a story that hopefully make you feel better, all right? It's a story that we've been kind of walking through in a series where we've just been going through the book of Nehemiah. It's an Old Testament book written around 445 BC, so about 500 years before the time of Jesus, some of the last writings of the Old Testament, all right? So the story goes, let me kind of bring you up to speed. This noble Jewish man who was working in the palace of the Persian king, Artaxerxes, during the time after or at the end of the exile. Okay, so the nation of Israel had been divided into two nations. The northern nation had been conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC. All right, then in 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered the nation of Judah, took all the people into exile. Persia conquers Babylon. And now you've got this guy, Nehemiah, in the palace of the Persian king. He hears word that the city of Jerusalem is still in disrepair. For 70 years, the people lived in exile, the Jewish people. They were allowed to return. Only a few returned. Many just stayed in the regions where they were exiled. Some returned. And when they returned, though, they returned with the mentality they had in exile. Every man for himself. Everybody just looking out for their own interests, using their money to abuse the poor, using their power to take advantage of the weak. And so as a result, the city laid in disrepair. Nehemiah, he heard news of this, his heart broke, and so he cried out to God and he prayed for his city. After he prayed, he became part of the response of God to answering that prayer. And so he gets the permission from the king and the blessing of the king to go home and lead his people to rebuild this city. And that's what he does. So he returns, he rallies all of the people in this city to rebuild the broken walls of this city. And as they rebuild the walls, they're rebuilding the protection, the safety, the dignity, and the economic well-being of this city. All right, so they rebuild the city, but then they discover after they rebuild the walls that the people still have a mindset of being enslaved and abused and taken advantage of. And so he has to challenge them to begin to live differently. And so he does just that. He challenges people to give to the poor, to not cheat people or rip them off. And so there's several lessons in how he rallies the people to serve rather than demand to be served, to sacrifice rather than to be have others sacrificing for them, to be set free, right? And then you get to the end of the book. So we're jumping ahead to the very end where chapter 12 is going to be all about celebration. And when we get there, we find a list of names. In fact, this is how Nehemiah chapter 12, verse 1 begins. These were the priests and the Levites who returned with Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and with Joshua, Seraiah, Jeremiah, Ezra, Amariah, Malach, Matsu, Shechaniah, Rahum, Meremoth. And I could just continue to read. And some of you, as I'm reading, we get bored and be like, what is Patrick reading this list for? Let me tell you why. Every one of these names are priests and Levites, people working in the temple of God, people working for God, who become leaders and influencers in the city in order to bring the people back to God. They owe their leadership to Nehemiah because Nehemiah is rebuilding the city walls. And because they rebuild the city walls, then they begin to rebuild the temple. And so you have a restoration of worship and sacrifice in the temple. But what's cool is every one of these names, which, for you and I, thousands of years removed from any of these names, we don't think anything of this. And so why does it matter? Why is there a list of names here? Because there's a list of names in your life. For Laura, two of those names would be Grandma Babs and Grandpa Anthony. Her grandparents, I didn't grow up with my grandparents actively involved in my life. And so when Laura and I started dating, her grandparents became my grandparents. And here are these, from the old country, Italy, and they love me. I always say I'm the second favorite grandchild in a long list of grandchildren. You have Laura, who is number one, and then I snuck in at number two, and everybody else is secondary, because they really loved me. They fed me, which was really their great sign of loving me because they were Italian. But I also listened to the way they invested into their family and how they spoke about God, how they spoke about work, how they spoke about family. And it was powerful to have that kind of influence. So their names are on the list. For me, when growing up, my parents would give some of their close friends, like they would refer to them in our life as grandma and grandpa. As aunt and uncle. And so we have a long list of people who we call them like grandma or grandpa, but they weren't really, but because they had a great influence in our life. And so if I had a list of names, their names would be listed here. Why? Because there are people that have invested into you, that have built you up, and they're part of your backstory. And then there's a list of names of people you've maybe impacted. And so who's on that list? People who've invested into you, people who you're investing into, who you're the name that they would put on the list, people who've helped build their story. Here is the thing. Let's continue jumping in. The walls are rebuilt and the people want to celebrate. You get to verse 27 and it reads this way. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully with the dedication, with songs and thanksgiving, and with music of cymbals and harps and lyres. The musicians were also brought together from the region around Jerusalem. I mean, they're bringing people in from all around to join in this great celebration and dedication of the walls that were rebuilt. And so it says they were brought in from the regions around Jerusalem, from the villages of the Netophites, who knows if I said that correctly, from Beth Gilgal and the area of Gibeah, Asmaveth. For the musicians had built villages for themselves around Jerusalem. When the priests and the Levites had purified themselves ceremonially, they purified the people, the gates and the walls. And then Nehemiah says, I had the leaders of Judah go up on top of the walls. And so they began this like great celebration. And they began to dedicate the walls in worship and singing. And what happens is this dedication, this celebration lasts not just in the moment of celebration, but it carries on to the point where those walls become central to the rebuilding of the city. Here's the key. What did Nehemiah do back in the palace? He had a vision that his city should not be in disrepair. He felt a call from God to make a difference. Here's the key. You want to know how you make a difference? You don't leave a legacy. It's not what you leave behind. You live a legacy. So let me challenge you. Don't live a legacy. Or don't leave a legacy. Live a legacy. What I mean is your life, the value of your life is not what you leave behind. A bank account, a retirement account, an investment, a house. It's how you live that becomes a story. It becomes an example. It becomes an influence. You become a name on a list of someone's story of people who influence them significantly to become who they are. That's your legacy. It's how you live that's your legacy, not what you leave. Now, wouldn't that be great? That you and I could live our lives, that the most valuable thing we could ever give someone is our own life. That the greatest riches we could ever offer someone is our example. That's what I'm talking about here. It's not what you leave, it's what you live. But most of us are living like Easy Eddie. You and I would compromise to settle for a mansion. We would compromise to settle for an enjoyable life right now, not giving much thought to the example we're living and leaving for others. The challenge is that we settle for the Easy Eddie life because something's broken inside of us. We have a broken value system. We calculate worth the wrong way. We see our value by our valuables and our worth by our net worth. And this is not a message about money, but about looking at the account of our life, not based on our bank accounts or our stock portfolio or whatever it is, your car, your house, whatever it is you think you're worth. No, the reason why we're broken and we value things that way is because we have a spiritual bankruptcy, a spiritual emptiness. In essence, our life is cut off spiritually with no future. So then we settle for today. Why is our life cut off spiritually? Because of sin. Sin is disregarding God. And the result of a heart that every one of us have bent on sin is that not only do we disregard God, but then we do what we want because it feels good, it's enjoyable now, not giving thought to tomorrow. And the result is that we live a life of sin, separated from God, headed toward a tomorrow facing the judgment of God, kind of like Easy Eddie. And that judgment is a forever without God. That's sin. But God. God desires to write a new story with our life. That's right. Sin separates us from God, causes us to compromise by settling for today, and we're forfeiting tomorrow. But God intervened in our story by becoming one of us. The story of Nehemiah is a story about rebuilding the protection of a city, rebuilding the walls, and eventually they rebuild the temple. The temple and the walls that stood during the time of Jesus. This story is pointing ahead to Jesus, when the ultimate restoration of worship to God would come. How? Because God would become one of us. Jesus came from heaven to earth to die on the cross, to forgive us of our sins. He took on the penalty of our eternal judgment. He absorbed the shame and the sin and the guilt and the punishment that comes from God against sin. The good God must punish sin. And so instead of it coming against us, it came against Jesus. So he absorbed that in our place and died once for all. But Jesus didn't stay dead. He rose from the dead, victorious, triumphant, and giving us victory in his resurrection. That anybody who believes in Jesus by faith is forgiven and given new and forever life. But not just a forever life when you're looking ahead to eternity. A new life where now it's not just about what you can get out of this life. It's not just about, what you can have like Easy Eddie. It's about looking at your life and saying, I can live a new kind of life. Wait, so let me pause right here. Maybe for you, you've been living for yourself, or you've made decisions that you regret. Maybe you have shame that you're carrying. You haven't really thought much about the long-term trajectory of your life or the eternal trajectory of your life. But right now, you're recognizing that the only hope and the only help is Jesus. Would you right now say yes to Jesus. Look, there's nothing you've ever done that God can't forgive. This is not about looking back on your past and regret. No, God can forgive your past. It's about having a hope in tomorrow. And so can I encourage you? Would you receive new life through faith in Jesus? Would you allow him to forgive you of your sin and give you a new beginning? And if you're ready to make that decision, would you let us know? Saying yes to Jesus, and you can let us know. We're going to put a QR code on the screen. You can scan that. Let our campus, when you fill out the form, our pastors will follow up with you to encourage you and cheer you on as you begin this new journey in relationship with God, a journey that is about living for the future, about living a legacy, not leaving a legacy. What does that look like if you go back into the story of Nehemiah? I want to pull some lessons out of this story for you. The first, we already read this, but I want to kind of extract a few thoughts. Verse 27 and 28. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with music of cymbals and harps and lyres. The musicians were also brought together from the region around Jerusalem. What they did was they brought all of these people together. They brought the priests and the Levites and the musicians together from all the surrounding region to lead in a great dedication of the walls, a celebration, which was really an acknowledgement that everything that they built was actually built by God. That was the point. And so they said, God, we want to worship you because what we did, we didn't do. You did it. Imagine being able to look back at your life in celebration. Imagine the people in your life, when they look back on your life, they could celebrate because your life was not about you, but a life that God built. And so your life becomes an expression of worship. How? Because you focus on what is eternal rather than temporary. You focus on the long term rather than the immediate. Remember, instant gratification is the tyrant of tomorrow. Getting what I want today will destroy what I want tomorrow. And so how do I do that? If I'm going to live a legacy, then I have to focus on eternity rather than the temporary. What matters forever? Can I just challenge you? Maybe right now, whisper in your own life, what am I doing that will matter forever? What difference am I making in eternity? It's a question I ask every day. God, like I say something like that, what will I do today that will matter for eternity? And what it does is it causes me to look at my schedule, look at how I'm investing my time, think about it as an investment. Think about my conversations. Are my interactions with my kids eternally valuable, or are they just easy and comfortable and relaxed? Am I willing to address things that should be addressed, or am I just settling for the enjoyable good that I want today? The challenge is when they rebuilt these walls, they were rebuilding dignity. They were rebuilding protection. They were rebuilding worship. And so they were building things that mattered. They're rebuilding the dignity of a city. And so you and I need to take a long-term view of our life of what are we living for. Look, if you look ahead 100 years from now, the reality is 100 years from now, well, okay, put it in perspective. Let's go back 100 years. 1924. Few of you know the names of your family members who were alive in 1924. For us, we have like one name. My grandfather was actually alive in 1924. Yeah. And maybe some of you, your grandfathers were alive, your grandparents were alive then. But you know, like 100 years ago is long enough that like, you don't know much about those people. You don't know what they were doing in 1924. Fast forward 100 years from now, in the year 2124, you and I, our names will be nothing more than like a little footnote It'll be a name on a list. But what you do and how you lived will make a difference. Your bank accounts probably won't have mattered. The house won't make a difference. The cars you drove won't even be in a junk pile anymore. It'll be disintegrated, be nothing left. Everything you've worked so hard to get will be nothing. But the way you lived will matter. So what does Nehemiah do? He rallies the people. And the story goes something like this. He goes, I had all the leaders of Judah go up on top of the wall. And so they're up on the wall, and here's the second one. The second choir, so he has choirs put together, huge choirs, and they go up on these massive walls that they built. The second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. I followed them on top of the wall together with half the people. And then in verse 40, the two choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. Basically, they did this like march where they got up on the walls, and this huge choir goes around. They march around the walls worshiping God, and then they all came together and they began to worship God in the house of God. And the point was this, that they built something that lasted. What are you building that will last? Let me explain this. As I said, the walls that they built and the temple they built were standing in the time of Jesus. 500 years later. Now, you and I are not called to build necessarily physical walls and physical temples. No, in fact, in the New Testament, we are the temple of God. The walls we build, which is dignity and protection and safety, we build walls around our families in prayer, in the example that we live, right? In what way can you give something and live something that will live on for 500 years? Prayers will outlast you. Are you praying the kind of prayers that will give your children, your grandchildren, and future generations something to stand on and worship for? Generosity goes on beyond us. Our giving outlives us. Our serving outlasts us. Prayer, giving, and service have generational impact. What are you building that lasts? Are you willing to live in such a way that it's not about you, it's not about your name, it's not about your reputation, it's not about your pleasure, it's about giving your life away to something that outlasts you? In fact, at the dedication of the temple, they sang a psalm, and it read something, it's recorded in Psalm 127, verse 1 and 2, where it says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain. It's in vain to rise up early and to stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. What was the point? They were saying, if God isn't in this, we're wasting our time. If God isn't protecting us, we're wasting our time. In fact, if you work and labor really hard, but it's not based on God's purposes, it's a waste of time, because God wants to give his people rest. Here is what you notice. There's this challenge to build what lasts. Building your life, are you living your life in such a way that it will outlast you? Let's land the reading of this story with this one more little part. Verse 43. And on that day, they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard from far away. They were willing to sacrifice and worship, and their sound became a song to the surrounding cities and nations. They lived sacrificially. If you want to live a legacy, not just leave a legacy, you and I have to live sacrificially. This is the story of Jesus. Jesus sacrificed his life for us, and now we live because of his sacrifice. We're not called to be the Messiah. We're never going to do what Jesus did, but we are called to live the way Jesus lived. In fact, one of the key steps of becoming like Jesus is to live a crucified life. The Apostle Paul wrote it this way. We crucify ourselves daily. Hanging on a cross. What did he mean? I mean, it was this idea of being willing to put your own ego, your own desires, your own agenda, your own interests to death, put your sin to death, your sin drives to death, being willing to put those things to death that get in the way of living sacrificially. So you put that stuff to death every day, and then you live to give. You live to serve. You live sacrificially. And the sacrifice becomes a legacy. The worship becomes a legacy. Let me read you another story. I thought you guys would appreciate a few stories today, and so let me read you a separate one. It's from World War II, which produced so many heroes. One such hero was a man named Butch OHare, who was a fighter pilot on an aircraft carrier in the South Pacific. One day, his entire squadron was sent on a mission, but he looked down and realized as they were flying out on the mission, they had already gone out a long way away from the aircraft carrier. He looked down and realized that the mechanic didn't top off his tank with fuel, and so he didn't have enough fuel to complete the mission. And so he got permission to get out and go back to the aircraft carrier. As he's going back, he's flying high, and he sees an entire squadron of Japanese Zeros headed toward the carrier, realizing that they're defenseless because all the other fighter pilots are out on the sortie. They're out on a mission. And so what does he do? He selflessly and sacrificially begins to fly his plane down, attacking these Zeros and shooting his 50 cal at them, shoots out 1 Zero, and then comes back and does it again. And eventually, he runs out of ammo. And so he starts flying his plane and trying to clip the wings of these Zeros. He figures, hey, I don't have any ammo, but at least I can clip their wings and maybe knock a few of them out of the sky. I better find where I'm at in the story. I kind of read it enough times, I felt like I could just tell it. But what I have here is he was desperate to do anything he could to keep them from reaching the American ships. Finally, the exasperated Japanese squadron took off in another direction. Deeply relieved, Butch OHare and his tattered fighter limped back to the carrier. Upon arrival, he reported in and related the events surrounding his return. The film from the camera mounted on his plane told the tale. It showed the extent of Butch's daring attempt to protect his fleet. He had destroyed 5 enemy bombers. That was on February 20th, 1942. And for that action, he became the Navy's first ace of World War II and the first naval aviator to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. And a year later, he was killed in combat at the age of 29. In fact, his hometown would not let the memory of his sacrifice die with him. And so today, O'Hare Airport in Chicago is named after Butch OHare, this fighter pilot. Butch OHare's story is even more significant in how it overlaps with Easy Eddie's. Easy Eddie, let's go back to his story. He made a difficult decision when he was looking at his life and what he wanted to leave behind. Wanting to offer his son a good name was far more important to him than all the riches he could lavish. So he decided to rectify all of his wrongs and go to the authorities and tell them the truth about Scarface Al Capone. His desire was to clean up his tarnished name and offer his son some semblance of integrity. To do this, he must testify against the mob. And he knew that it would cost him greatly. But more than anything, he wanted to be an example to his son. He wanted to do his best to make restoration and hopefully have a good name to leave his son. So he went to court and he testified against Al Capone, the leader of the mob in Chicago. As a result, within a year, as you could imagine, Easy Eddie died in a blaze of gunfire on a lonely Chicago street. But he had given his son the greatest gift he had to offer at the greatest price he could ever pay. What you probably are already connecting is that Butch OHare was Easy Eddie's son. Man, come on. Now, some of you are going to want that story. Like, you can literally Google it yourself. But here's why this matters in a message about living a legacy. See, But Easy Eddie could have died and left a legacy of money and mansions and mob. But instead, he recognized that he had to live a legacy, which is to live leaving behind some integrity, leave behind some good name, leave behind something worth following. And that's what he gave his son Butch, who followed that example of selfless sacrifice, of giving your life for something bigger than yourself. Come on. You could preach this. Here's the point. What are you willing to live for that's worth dying for? See, the Christian life, the way of Jesus, is one of living a life that's not about me, that's living for others, and more than anything, living for God. Would you give up this life to gain, not earning eternal life, but giving up this life for what you can do for eternity? How will you pray? How will you give? How will you serve for things that matter forever? Okay, let me land it with this. Simply giving you a challenge. In what way can you begin to live a legacy so that your life is the richest thing you could ever give the next generation? And today, how can you begin to invest in the next generation? Can I pray with you? Can I pray over you? Jesus, thank you for giving your life so that we can be forgiven and given new and forever life. You gave the ultimate sacrifice to give us a forever life. And then you've given us this temporary assignment, a very brief moment on earth to live selflessly and boldly for you. God, we want to live our lives so that we live a legacy by building what lasts on what lasts, by living sacrificially. God, help us right now to recognize the places in our life where we need to be willing to give that up for what matters most. Give revelation to everyone hearing this message of the places in their life where they need to be willing to yield the pleasures of today for the promises of tomorrow. Help us to begin to live sacrificially, selflessly, in light of eternity for what matters. Help us to live a legacy that points others to you. In Jesus' name.